LJ mentioned, my name is Jonathan Saben. I'm a corporate attorney at Folger Levin. It's a full service law firm based out of San Francisco, and I'm the chair of our corporate department. And as LJ mentioned, the topic I'm going to cover today is legal entities for a socially impactful business. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen if I'm able to do that. Looks so far so good. All right, so let's jump into it. Oh, there we go. First, some disclaimers. Is required by our ethical rules. This presentation is for informational purposes only, does not constitute legal tax advice, is not intended to create, does not create attorney-client relationship, and anyone viewing the presentation should not act upon the information without seeking professional counsel. I'm sure the other attorneys on this panel and may have their own disclaimers, or they're welcome to refer to this, but apply to them as well. You know, I should also say that I'm a California attorney. I know we have a global audience here, so I might get into some kind of underlying stuff that I'm not going to assume a lot of knowledge about kind of how attorneys are regulated in the United States. Attorneys are licensed by state, so I'm licensed to practice law in California. Can also work in Delaware, and I'll get into Delaware during this presentation. But this presentation is going to generally focus on entities that are available under California law. All right, so I'm going to jump into it. Key takeaways. I'm going to start with a spoiler. There's no one entity that's going to work for every purpose. It's not going to be, I can't give you the answer right now as to what is the best entity for you. Yeah, and that's because there's many different forms of entities that you can use to form and run a socially impactful business. It's going to depend on your goals and objectives and the business itself. But my view is, and I think many practitioners' views is that the standard, most commonly used forms of entities in the United States will, and which I'll go on today, will work to form and run a socially impactful business. The ultimate goal in choosing an entity is to set yourself up for success. You want to have the right platform at the beginning to operate and grow in an efficient manner and in a way that you want. And I have seen instances where the wrong entity choice was chosen, and it can create complications down the road. And with that in mind, because we have a global audience today, what I'd like to do with this presentation is to give a high-level overview of some of the different types of entities that are available, mainly in California, but also in the United States, and some related matters. So there's three takeaways I'd like you to have from this presentation. Number one, I'd like you to have a sense of the entities that are commonly used. Number two, I'd like you to be familiar with some of the major issues to consider when selecting an entity. And number three is, when you're ready to form an entity, that you go talk with an attorney. There are many online services out there that will help you form an entity, or LegalZoom and other online places that will do it. An attorney can do that as well. But the value of talking with an attorney, it's not the mechanical filing. It's about that they can help you analyze and think through which entity choice is the right one for you. And that might be a 5-minute conversation. It might be more in depth, but it should be, talk with an attorney when you're ready. All right, and let's get on to the potential entity structures. The two most common entity structures in the United States, and that probably is going to work for a socially impactful business, for at least a for-profit making one, is a corporation or a limited liability company. A corporation is going to end with a corp or an inc or incorporated. Those all are designations of a corporation. A limited liability company ends with an LLC or with periods in between the letters. I'm going to go into more detail about these two entities in a little bit, but I wanted to introduce them here as the most common forms of entities. And I'm going to say a word about C corps and S corps. Some of you might be familiar with corporations and have heard that that there's a C corp and an S corp, and what's the difference? The difference is tax, and I'll talk about later. But C corps have 2 layers of taxation, more tax. They can be more tax inefficient. S corps have 1 layer of taxation. Now, S corps are beyond the scope of this presentation. But before you go and start asking about, well, why doesn't everybody use S corps? There's a number of restrictions on S corps that makes it not a very attractive vehicle for many ventures. And why C corp? Why S corp? Why those letters? The tax code is divided into chapters and subchapters, and the taxation is subchapter C of the tax code and subchapter S for the S corp. It's the S corp election. So corporate attorneys and tax attorneys aren't very creative, and so they just pick the name from the chapters. That's the C corp and S corp. There are many other entities that are available. I'm going to talk about, just since we're talking about socially impactful businesses, there are 2 entities in California. Now, every state may not have these, or they may have different flavors of them. In California, we have what's called a benefit corporation and a social purpose corporation. And these are, their purpose is to create a general public benefit, be it environmental or health, or achieve a social purpose. And those purposes are hardwired into the corporate governance. And I wanted to raise them because you might come across them thinking about a socially impactful business and say, these are not widely used entities. I don't see you don't see them very much. They're new. They were created the last 10 to 15 years ago. And practitioners tend not to use these I think for 2 reasons. Number one, they're new. And so there's not a lot of law around how these organizations are supposed to work. And lawyers don't like ambiguity. And combine that with the fact that the most commonly used entity forms, a corporation or LLC, most practitioners think work just fine. So combine the ambiguity and the newness with an existing structure that is going to work, results in these entities not being widely used. And I'll say something about the B corporation. You might have heard about a B corp. So now we have a B corp and C corp and S corp. A B corp does not mean benefit corporation. A B corp is not a legal entity. It is a private certification from a company called B Lab. And that is where for-profit companies that demonstrate a high level of social and environmental performance can get certified by B Labs and call themselves a B Corp. But from a corporate law perspective, it is not an entity. It's not a legal entity. So you might be a C Corp that then has a B Corp certification. And there's other forms of entities. You have nonprofit corporations, which internationally is NGOs. And these are your charities and educational institutions that might be appropriate. And you have a whole host of others that are going to differ from each other in various ways, from governance to liability protection. You have a professional corporation, limited partnerships, limited liability partnerships, general partnerships, and sole proprietorships. Our law firms are limited liability partnerships because law firms can only be certain types of entities. But by and large, at the end of the day, I think the 2 types of entities that you'll probably end up using in a for-profit context are going to be a corporation and limited liability company. At least those are the 2 most commonly used. So hopefully that gets you have some, to the first takeaway, some sense of the entities that are commonly used. Now, considerations to think about when selecting an entity. So when somebody comes to me and says, Jonathan, I'd like to form an entity. These are the items that I'm going to talk to a client about, and I'm going to think about. Number one, do you need to raise capital? If so, from who? Because that can decide, or at least tilt, which entity you're going to want to choose. Taxation. does tax efficiency matter? One layer of taxation versus having a pass-through tax entity where there's only one layer of taxation. Is the company going to have losses that you're going to want to be able to utilize? What's your exit strategy? Folks find it, may find it odd. One of the first questions I ask them when they say, hey, I'm going to start a business. I say, great, what's your exit, right? Because you should have a business plan, and the business plan may have an exit. And how you want to exit, how you plan to exit could dictate what entity choice you choose at the beginning. Management and control. Are there unique things about how you want to manage and control your organization that could dictate what entity choice you use? How do you want to compensate employees? Are you going to want to use equity? I've seen because some forms of entities are easier and more straightforward to issue equity to employees. I've seen entity choices be based on this factor. Cost and ease of formation. Is that a factor? Some, depending on the complexity of a business, one entity choice might be a lot more time consuming and expensive to form than another. And personal liability, I assume everybody who's starting a business wants to limit their liability to their investment. And so obviously want to choose a form of limited liability. So these are the considerations that I think about, at least the major ones, in selecting which entity to choose. And I'm going to have a note on how I'm doing on time here.
What about 5 minutes left?
5 minutes. All right. So doing good. Where to organize? Entities are state specific, and in the United States. So you have 50 states, and you could organize your entity in one of those 50 states. So which one to choose? You form, generally, you got to form where you're located, where you're doing business. For example, if you're located in California, doing business in California, and your nexus is really California, California is a good choice as to where to form. You can do business in the United States and internationally, but it's this where you're organized is going to govern the internal laws of the internal governance of the organization. Another popular jurisdiction is Delaware. Why Delaware? A lot of ink has been spent writing about Delaware as a popular jurisdiction. At the end of the day, it's a lot of entities are formed in Delaware. And I think in large part, it's because they have a very well-developed corporate law. They have very sophisticated courts who understand corporate law. And for lawyers and business folks, the rules of the road are very clear in Delaware as to the internal governance of organizations. And so that leads to more efficiency, less disputes. And so I think having that sophisticated jurisprudence makes that an attractive jurisdiction in which to organize. And so as a California attorney, I'll organize entities in California and also Delaware because I end up practicing there, or at least familiar with those laws, I should say. Also, it's very user-friendly. The remaining time, I said the two most commonly used forms of entities are going to be a corporation and an LLC. I'd like to go kind of one level deeper and just to kind of talk about what are some characteristics of each. First, some nomenclature of a corporation. The owners are called shareholders or stockholders, depending on the jurisdiction in which you're formed. The control, a corporation is controlled and governed by a board of directors who then elect or appoint officers. And that's your president, treasurer, CFO, and secretary that handle the day-to-day operations of the business. So the shareholders elect the directors then elect or appoint, hire the officers. Corporations have limited liability to the owners. There are instances where it's what's called piercing the corporate veil, which is where folks may try to go after the owners to pierce the liability protection. But by and large, corporations, and I'll talk about LLCs, are limited liability vehicles. Taxation, this is the big one for corporations. There's two layers of taxation for corporations. What do I mean by that? There's a tax at the corporate level and shareholder level. For example, if a corporation makes $100, it'll be taxed on $100. Now, then that reduced amount is stuck within the corporation. for it to get out to the shareholders or stockholders, it has to do that by what's called a dividend. And once those dollars go up to the shareholder, it is taxed again as income to the shareholder. So there's tax at the corporate level and another tax again at the shareholder level. Now, why would you choose to have that type of structure, which can be tax inefficient depending on tax rates? In large part, it depends on your investors. If I'm in Silicon Valley, and for firms that want VC funding, you'll end up generally for their own tax reasons, they want their investments to be corporations and also organized in Delaware. They're investor friendly. They've been around for a long time, and investors know them, and the rules about kind of how their investments are governed are very clear. And I know I'm running short on time, so I'll hurry up. Giving equity to employees and corporations is generally very straightforward. Think about stock options, and it's simple and easy to form. And I'll talk briefly about LLCs, limited liability companies. The key thing here, they're very flexible entities. And that's a good thing and bad thing. The good thing is they're very flexible, so you can tailor them to exactly how you want. The downside is you can tailor them to exactly how you want. So you got to think about all this stuff up front, and it can make things complicated. And I'll put all these out real fast, and I'll go through them. The nomenclature, which is the ownership, they're owned by members, and the entity can be controlled as either member managed by the members, or it can be a manager member managed entity, which is somebody else manages it. You can have officers. Again, like a corporation, is limited liability. Key thing is on the taxation, it's a single layer of tax. It's a pass-through tax entity. So if the LLC makes $100 and it's only owned by one member, it's as if the one member made $100. So there's one layer of tax. Generally, it's investor friendly. Investors know these. You can take on investments, but some investors are not going to like this entity as an investment vehicle. Think about VC firms, and there are ways to structure them, but it gets quite complicated. And giving equity to employees in an LLC can get complicated. There's ways to do it, but it's not as straightforward and known as a stock option. And it can create some ramifications for the employees and their own taxes. Ease of formation. And it's going to depend on the complexity of the business. If it's not very complicated, it can be quite simple and inexpensive to form. If you have very complicated business structure or kind of governance, it can be quite expensive to form. So I know I am short on time, and I'm out of time. So I want to say thank you, and I'll leave because I think Chinye is next with her colleague. Is one of the things I do talk about with clients. Not only it's just important as choosing the right entity, is getting the employee and contractor classification correct, because while you can correct a lot of things on the corporate front, you may not be able to correct without running into a lot of headaches, how you deal with employees and contractors. So thank you.